G'day guys, welcome to the Noob Spearo podcast. This is the spearfishing show where we interview spearfishing experts, authorities and characters from around the world, share their tips, stories and advice right here for free on the Noob Spearo podcast. Today's episode with Ed Martin from Killshot Spearguns comes about in part because of this request from Eric in the US. He says, Shrek and Turbo, excellent podcast, guys. I've learned a lot in 100 episodes. The wealth of knowledge shared from across the globe has definitely increased my awareness of the lifestyle and made me a better Spearo. Listening to the experiences of so many great divers is the reason I joined the club. It's also great to have on my commute every day. One area I'd like to hear more about is how guys who make custom wooden spear guns come to decide on shape, design, wood, length, etc., given their target species and ocean conditions. The entire process from idea to food on the table. Just a thought and a request. Looking forward to the next 100 episodes. So thanks, Eric, for that review of the podcast, and it's always great to get these ideas fleshed out and made into something. So today's episode is part one of 2 episodes with Ed Martin. This first episode just focuses right in on wooden spear guns, and it's fantastic. Ed Martin, Killshot Spearguns, he makes fantastic simple spear guns that have come about from a process. I'll just read a little bit of a spiel from his website. He says, "We make great simple spear guns. I'm the owner and builder of and the one thing I've learned through my thousands of days on and in the water is that shit breaks. The more complex the system is, the more likely it is to fail." He says, "I'm sure that everyone will agree that the only time they've ever broken, abandoned or busted a trigger is while I've been on the water. It's frustrating." He said, "So when I set out to build a spear gun, I tried to solve the problems that I've encountered myself. As a consequence, I've designed a spear gun that should give you years of trouble-free service while still looking good." And Ed was kind enough to jump on the podcast with me, and I think this is pretty comprehensive. We get right into the weeds with building a wooden spear gun. And it was a real pleasure to chat with Ed, who's also a patron listener. Now, if you want to support the show, you listen all the time, head over to patreon.com/NoobSpearo and join a whole bunch of other people supporting the show. Every single dollar on there goes to support trips where I get to come out and meet guests and listeners and hopefully record a whole lot of interviews on the road and also go get some spearing. And you might have heard the last 3 episodes that I recorded in New Zealand, which were all recorded in early March 2020, and that was fantastic. I'm looking forward to getting over to the US hopefully next year. But anyway, hey, let's get into this episode with Ed Martin, DIY wooden spear guns with the man from Killshot Spearguns. You're in for a treat. This special episode of the Noob Spearo podcast is brought to you by spearfishing.com.au. Long-time partners of the Noob Spearo podcast, spearfishing.com.au have a listener deal. Use the code NoobSpearo to save $20 on every purchase over $200. Thanks for supporting the Noob Spearo podcast and shopping with spearfishing.com.au. This episode of the Noob Spearo podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at noobspearo.com/audible. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Who uses those? Anyway, noobspearo.com/audible. Well, welcome to today's Noob Spearo podcast, guys. It's an honour and a privilege to bring Ed Martin from Killshot Spearguns, based down in the Florida Keys. How do I say it, Ed? Islamorada? Islamorada, there we go. So how far down the Keys are you?
We are at mile marker 81.9, but we're about 40 miles in to the Keys. Key West is 80 miles away.
Okay. All right, cool. It's a really unique part of the world geographically. In my part of the world, we're kind of unfamiliar with the way it works. Can you describe it, sort of the geography of the Florida Keys and how it sort of works?
Sure. Well, the Florida Keys are part of the Florida Reef Tract, which is actually, I think it's the 3rd largest coral reef in the world.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I mean, you guys have got the Great Barrier Reef, so you beat us there. But I think the reef off of Belize is number 2, and then we're number 3.
Oh, wow.
But the Keys are basically, it's considered an almost like an atoll or a lagoon, part of it. But it's a string of islands that runs about 130 miles, 140 miles long, and starts up by Miami and runs all the way down to Fort Jefferson there at the Dry Tortugas. The depths the water here for the most part stays anywhere from 70 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, or between about 21 and 32 degrees C.
Yeah, right.
We've got great fishing because of all the reef out there. You've got kind of a shallow area that runs all the way up to the mainland, and that's called Florida Bay, and that is probably anywhere from 5 to 9 feet deep.
Okay.
Then you get to the Keys, and then on the other side you have the Atlantic Ocean or the Straits of Florida, and the reef runs out. You've got sand and patch reef going out about 5 miles, and at about between 4 and 6 miles out, the reef drops away. And for those of you that are using a metric system, roughly 10K out is where the main reef begins. And the reef is about 1 kilometer long or about a half-mile wide. And it goes from about 10 meters down to about 25 meters, and then drops pretty much straight off to about 30 meters. And then from 30, you get sand, and it runs out. You pick up about 100 feet or about 30 meters, 30 meters every mile or something like that.
Okay.
So it's a nice place to get to swim and dive and fish and everything else.
And a highway sort of connects a lot of it.
Yes.
And you're so you were saying you're like, was it 60 miles south of Miami, or are you a bit further than that?
Yeah, we're about 60 miles south of Miami. We're roughly we're about 40 miles from the mainland. Okay. And then it's another 80 miles down to Key West, and you can drive all the way down to Key West.
Yeah, wow. That's amazing. Amazing bit of infrastructure there.
It is. Yeah, it's quite a bridge system, and the amazing thing is that it was initially the initial road system was set up by Flagler when he built the railroad, and back in the 20s and 30s. Wow. In fact, one of our biggest tragedies was I can't remember what year it was. I think it was 35. The hurricane wiped out a bunch of his railroad workers. Oh, wow. I've heard estimates, in the tens of thousands of people that died that weekend. So
and you don't have any shortage of hurricanes there, do you?
Some years are better than others. So the thing with hurricanes is it's a disaster in slow motion, and in the United States, if you die in a hurricane, you kind of got it coming. It's you can see it coming for weeks ahead of time. So okay. And to be honest with you, the next one that comes, provided it's not a super monster, I'll stay. Yeah. And if I'm unlucky enough to get hit by a tree or.
So you batten down the hatches, put the storm shutters up. Is that kind of the way it works? Everyone sort of down that whole Keys area has a strategy in place for dealing with them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and the building codes are very, very good. We had what was probably the most powerful hurricane in the last 100 years, 3 years ago, that hit just 30, 40 miles down the road from us. And here, my sign out front got ripped off the building. But there was no damage to the building other than that. That's amazing. My house itself had zero damage, and I was 40 feet from the Atlantic Ocean. Wow. Every one of my neighbors, I feel bad for my neighbors. Every one of them had water intrusion into their house. I was just flat out lucky.
Yeah, wow. That's incredible. Over here, like we were talking about a little bit about the Great Barrier Reef. When we get hurricanes up there, or cyclones, however you want to call them, they stir up and destroy the reef pretty bad at times, and sometimes it also means that we get a big bout of ciguatera, because when that reef gets disturbed and that dinoflagellate, the thing that ends up poisoning people as it sort of goes up the food chain, that's what sort of causes this ciguatera outbreaks. Do you have the same thing in your area?
Well, we do have an issue with ciguatera. It's not very prevalent here. Now, we don't eat parrotfish, which is a biggie. And a lot of people won't eat barracuda. Now, if I have a 4-foot barracuda swim in front of me. He's going home in the cooler. But I grew up as a kid eating barracuda, and I've loved it, my entire life. So getting me to stop, it's going to take a neurotoxin to make me stop. But no, we do have an issue, and in fact, I had listened to one of your podcast where you guys had talked about ciguatera was prior to Hurricane Irma, and that was one of the things that I noted. I'm pretty sure that podcast was beforehand, but there were all kinds of advisories about staying out of the water. There's all kinds of stuff in the water and blah blah blah. The first time I went out was about 4 weeks after the storm, and the first 30 feet, 10 meters, it was just socked in. I mean, you put your hand in front of you, you couldn't see it.
Yeah, right.
But then you got down at about 10 meters, and all of a sudden it opened up. And the first time I dove down, I'm sitting there and I'm looking at the bottom, and I'm like, where in the hell am I? I can't see the bottom. And all of a sudden it dawned on me I could see the bottom. Everything was just white because everything was either covered with sand or it had been scoured clean. And all the fish were super shiny. Because a lot of them are able to adjust their color based on their condition or the conditions around them. So I dove down and I saw some really weird stuff. We have something called a big eye here. It's a reef fish. We commonly see them in the reef between anywhere from about 10 meters to 50, and typically you see them in there about 30 centimeters long. No, I'm sorry, about 20 centimeters long. When I dove down that first time, I saw one that I saw 3 of them actually, and they were probably close to 40 centimeters long. They're the biggest damn big eyes I've ever seen in my life. And what we figured out over the course of a few months was that a lot of deep water species got washed into the shallows or were just flat out lost. And so you had fish that were normally out there in 150 or 200, 300 feet. All of a sudden, they're in 20 feet of water. Yeah. So we saw some really weird shit.
Yeah, I was going to say, do you find when you get because you had that top 30 feet of the water column were sort of like, it was like a big thermocline, but you just had a lot of rubbish in that. Did that make the underneath that, was it darker, the water, and was therefore that one of the reasons maybe why some of these deeper water species were in shallow water as well?
It could be. I didn't consider that, but that's possible. One of
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just going to say, in New Zealand, there's one part in one of the sounds where they get a layer of 10 metres of fresh water, the top 30 feet of fresh water, and then underneath that, you get coral that's normally only found in depths of 100 metres in 15 metres of water. So sometimes that thermocline, if it's been there for a while, so I think it really adjusts the marine life and the ecosystem beneath it. So
that may very well be what did it. I'm pretty big into research diving, and used to work with one of the volunteer organizations here quite a bit. And I wouldn't be surprised. I'm going to go ask. So I might know some people that can actually answer that question.
Cool. The citizen science stuff's really interesting. I'm glad to hear you sort of. So, what do you take part in some of these projects, do you?
Well, yeah. Back in the between about 2010 and 2015, there was a lionfish program that was going on, and there were a couple of PhDs that were running around tagging fish, capturing fish, and killing fish. Lionfish in our area are invasive, and I know other guests have kind of talked about this, but lionfish are kind of a pest here. Well, they're not kind of; they are a pest here because they're a fish that eats until it can't eat anything else. They will just sit there and eat and eat and eat, not because they're hungry.
Yeah.
So they kill off a lot of the beneficial fish, like the cleaners, and they can literally decimate a reef. So we ran around for the better part of 5 years with them, or I ran around for the better part of 5 years with them, recording fish, catching fish. And it wasn't just lionfish. We were looking at all the different reef species, things that were a centimeter long all the way up to, a Cubera snapper that might swim by.
Yeah, okay.
Counting how many were in a given area and, what the habitat was like. And then we go to the next site and go do it all over again. And
yeah, awesome.
Yeah. You want to talk about diving in shitty conditions.
That seems to be what a lot of the marine biology and some of these projects end up being like. These crappy little grids are mapped out, and it's just counting every little minuscule thing and that. But a fantastic opportunity as well to really contribute and extend your own knowledge of the ecosystems that you dive in every day. So
yeah, it was really cool.
Hey, Ed, one reason I got you on the show, I'll just read you this. Eric from Santa Cruz, he's near you. He said, Shrek and Turbo, excellent podcast, guys. I've learned a lot in 100 episodes. He shines us on a little bit more. And then he says, one area I'd like to learn more about is how guys who make custom wood guns come to decide on shape, design, wood length, etc., given target species and ocean conditions. He wanted the entire process from idea, concept to food on the table. So that was a really cool request from Eric. Ed, you've been a patron of Noob Spearo for a little while. I really appreciate that. And you run Killshot Spearguns down there in the Keys. I thought it was a fantastic opportunity to get you on the show today and do that. So I'm really looking forward to digging in on wood spearguns in our Veterans Vault. But I really want to sort of learn about your journey getting to, owning a shop and, selling equipment and things like that. How did it all start for you? Like, what was the moment that your infatuation with the ocean began?
Well, one day I looked at my checkbook balance and I realized it was way too healthy. So I opened a dive shop.
It sounds like buying a boat, doesn't it?
Well, and on that end, I own 2 boats, so I'm really broke.
Oh, man.
No, it's to be honest, I've wanted to do something like this for a very, very long time. I've always had a very serious job. When I was in the military, I did military intelligence work. I was a security executive for big multinational firms, and I never knew when my phone was going to ring. And it was one of those things. My wife used to tell my friends tell her friends all the time that she was just waiting until the day I had a heart attack.
Wow.
It was just one of those things where there was constant stress. You're constantly traveling. You're living out of a suitcase, and I had kind of we had moved down to the Florida Keys, and I had kind of a weird year. I had a close family member that passed away, and then I had a very close friend that passed away, and it changed the way that I thought about my life and what I was doing, and I decided I don't need to go try to make people that I don't know happy. What I need to do is, work on the stuff that I have. And, so I banged around working for my wife and kind of, working as a dive instructor down here for a little bit. And then eventually I shut down my consulting company and opened up Killshot Spearguns. And it was one of those things where I was building spear guns anyway and kind of having fun with it. And I thought, I can sell these. I'm selling them to my friends and whatnot. I'll make a business of it. And, I just set out to build the best spear gun that I can build. And, I don't like to make a lot of compromises on that. I use good components.
I like your a bit of your bio there in the shop. We make great, simple spear guns. You like to keep it simple, but everything's sort of robust in your setups, and you really believe in sort of what you do. So it's cool to hear about that, and so like obviously the way you made spear guns then and the way you make spear guns now, has that changed much? How many years have you been doing it?
Well, I've been building them as a business for almost 5 years.
Okay.
And I've made several hundred guns at this point. I don't think I'm over 1,000, but I'm probably close.
Wow, that's a lot of guns, man.
It is a lot of damn guns. It's weird. I'll go 2-3 weeks and not sell a single one, and then all of a sudden I'll have somebody. Well, I'll have 10 people walk in a day, and it's like, oh, okay, back to work. But the goal is not to be making them one at a time, but eventually, to turn it into a decent business and actually grow it. I think anybody that starts a business, if they don't start it with that in mind, they're doomed to failure.
It's that the growth mindset. Just, you're always wanting to reach out and do the next thing. So have they changed from when you made your very first, or your first 100 spear guns to now you're making your 1,000th or whatever? What's changed?
So I've got my first spear gun hanging on the wall in the back, and it's behind a whole bunch of stuff for a reason. It's pretty ugly, but it was one of those things. Every time I build one, I learn something. So they've evolved over time. The basic design is very similar to what I started with, but they've become more refined, maybe a little sexier looking. There's a couple of things that I do. Like, I've got a gun that I use myself, and it's 5 years old, and it's more squared. But it's just as functional as the ones that I'm building today. The ones today, I think, just look nicer. My skill has improved. If you do anything enough, you're going to get better at it. And I am much, much better at making them today. And in fact, so a great example, I used to laminate all my guns because it was easier for me to make a laminated spear gun blank straight and then square it than it was for me to take a piece of wood and make it completely square.
Okay.
And it's just one of those things you learn over time how to do it. And these days I make them out of one piece of wood. And, so you've got a spear gun that's 2 meters long. Well, not 2 meters, but it's what, 1.5?
Yeah.
That's a long piece of wood. To make it completely square and completely straight is difficult. And a few years ago, I couldn't have done it. And today, I do 20 of them at a time. So,
is that why a lot of these guys make their stocks from a lot of composite material? Like sort of they cut out their molds and then epoxy them together. Is it easier to get it square, or is it the same as with a single piece of wood?
For me personally, I found that it was easier. And the reason is that when I glue mine up, I would use 2 pieces of angled aluminum, real heavy duty stuff, and I'd clamp it all together. So when I'm gluing that sucker up, it has no choice but to be straight because of where it's at. And then from there, when I pop it out, I've already got one side that's perfectly straight. So now I can square it with the table saw, and then it's just a matter of using the planer or other tools to get the sides parallel.
Okay, so cool.
Yeah.
Let's backtrack a little bit. It seems like we're going to go straight into wooden spear guns, which I don't mind because I think we've got a lot of ground to cover. But I do want to get back and hook into your story at some stage. But I just want to back it up, like wood versus pipe spear guns. How do you see the pros and cons of these two? Good question from Errol, actually, in the community.
Wood doesn't leak. That's one of the big differences between pipe guns and wood guns. If a pipe gun is built properly and maintained, it won't leak either. But almost all pipe guns have got a plug in them, and some of them have got O-rings. And when that plug deteriorates over time, they will, that rubber plug or bung or whatever it is that's in that pipe will begin to leak water. And then once you get the water inside there, it's going to slowly eat away at the inside of that gun, and sooner or later it'll compromise the integrity of the aluminum. My first spear gun, I had a spear gun made by Voight, of all things. I don't even think I know Voight isn't a company anymore.
I haven't even heard of a spear gun made by them. So,
but it was basically an Arbalete knockoff. I think Arbalete had licensed it to them, but I was given one back in like 1986, I think. And we'd get done with spearfishing for the day, and you would have to lean it upside down because the water would drain out of it. So, and it would take about an hour for that thing to drain. And as you used it during the day, it would get heavier and heavier and heavier. So that's one thing. Aluminum and carbon fiber, if something hits the side of the gun, It's going to make a lot of noise. That's something else. And then, I don't know.
Aesthetics and then possibly recoil dampening with a more solid frame as well is something I was thinking about. Aesthetically, people just love, like, there's nothing like looking at a big bit of timber gun, like, particularly if it's nice and carved and all the rest of it. I think they look really sexy, wooden guns.
I agree. I think they're more substantial. And from a weight perspective, your average reef gun, that's say a 110, is going to weigh about, let's say, roughly 5 pounds. So what, two and a half kilos, something like that. So it's going to be fairly heavy, where your pipe gun is going to weigh half that. And then when you throw those bands on there, if you're using 16 millimeter bands on that pipe gun, you're going to feel the recoil. So because there's no mass to absorb it in the water.
Yeah, which is a big reason why popularity of roller guns have gone up, because it does dampen the recoil a bit. But the wooden platform, I think, like, sometimes I notice when I pull on a pipe gun, especially if the handle is not really ergonomic, I end up flinching and doing all sorts of crazy stuff that pulls my shot. And I think that's just due to, getting used to preparing for the recoil. It's just like when you fire a high-powered firearm, you develop a flinch. That's why a lot of people use like a, what do they call it when the trigger just, hair trigger, but you can't really do that with a friction-based spear gun mechanism, as I learned from Duncan Henderson. But I think that's a big benefit of wooden spear guns, is not having to be so concerned with recoil.
This is always one of these things that kind of drives me a little nuts, because recoil doesn't have to be as bad as it is if the bands are properly tuned to the shaft and to the gun. So like on my shorter guns, I tend to use a 14 millimeter band, and on the longer guns, I tend to use 16 millimeter. And if we're using a 8 millimeter shaft, we definitely go with 16 millimeter bands versus 14. If we do 14 millimeter, then we go with 3 bands as opposed to 2. So it's one of those things where if you balance things out, at the end of the day, that gun should feel very comfortable to shoot. And what you'll find is you'll actually hit the target, and it will be much more predictable where that shaft is going to go than if it's more overpowered. You're kind of hitting around the target.
All right, let's go to something really simple. So, like concepting and planning, like your very first spear gun, Ed, where would you start for planning and making your very first gun? What if you were going to go back and do it all over again? How would you go about sort of putting that together? Would you borrow big or steal plans from someone and just sort of, more or less copy their model?
Well, that's exactly what I did. So when I sat down and built let's not say my first gun. Well, no, my first gun. What I did was I looked at the other guns that were on the market that were available for me to buy. And I said, well, I really don't want to pay that much for that gun. And I really like that feature on that particular gun. And I don't like this thing on that gun. So I'm going to get rid of that I don't like, and I'm going to add that which I do. And from there, I kind of figured out what I wanted. And I spent a lot of time thinking about it. The first thing that I did after that was I contacted a company up in Tampa, Florida, Neptonics. They carry all of the different trigger mechs that I used and everything. Those guys have been in business forever.
Yeah.
And, Josh Gregory, when I bought my first trigger mechanism, I bought it from Josh Gregory, and they were actually out in California at the time.
Okay.
And, he owned Neptonics at the time, and he's still an active partner in it. But anyway, I called them and talked to them, and, they gave me a little bit of information. I watched a bunch of YouTube videos, and I looked online. I ran around in stores secretly using a tape measure to see how long things were. Mm-hmm. And, I had to figure a lot of it out for myself, because there's really not a good book out there that shows you how to do it. Mm-hmm. But what I'll say is that when you make your first spear gun, I used to get on Spearboard all the time. And I would always used to kind of chuckle, because everybody's first gun is a 72-inch tuna gun with 5 rollers.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what, you want to make things difficult. add a roller. There's a whole lot going on. Build something simple. Build a 40-inch reef gun or a 110 gun that maybe you could use for pelagics or something like that. But build something fairly simple. When you get ready to go to actually build the gun, don't go buy $100 piece of teak. Go down to the hardware store and buy the cheapest piece of pine. Here in the States, you can get a pine 2x4 for $2.50. Take that home, cut it to the basic shape that you want that blank to be, and then dry fit everything on that gun.
Okay.
So, I've got pine prototypes sitting in the back room.
Okay.
The great thing is if I don't like them, I can throw them on the barbecue grill and cook a steak. I wasn't upset about it. But boy, you wanted to see me get mad. Watch me screw up a piece of teak, and there's a reason there's some holes in my wall. I don't throw things anymore.
While I was researching for this episode, I had a little bit of a look at the spearfishing subreddit. And searching for the edge, he said he advised prospective gun builders that the number one key to building a spear gun is around the spear. So, and then there's a lot of conversation about how much overhang from your barrel to have with spears. And I've had a good conversation with other gun builders about it. I'd really like your take on that bit of advice.
Overhang, man, that's one of those things. It's like talking about religion and politics.
It's a shit fight.
Okay, so my take on overhang, it does two things in my opinion, two basic things. It's an aim point, so it helps you line up your shot, and number two, it counterbalances the spear gun. If you've got a 72-inch shaft and a 40-centimeter gun, it's going to be like holding an anvil out there in your hand, because that your lever arm. If you think of a spear gun in your hand as your hand being the fulcrum of the lever, the further you extend that lever arm out and then put weight on it, the more difficult it's going to be for you to hold it. So overhang becomes a very big deal. I like to use between 10 and 13 inches of overhang. Anybody that doesn't know what that is, your calculator's got a unit function on it and can convert it to centimeters. But anywhere from 10 to 13 inches. And what I do is a 40-inch gun, which is basically a 75-centimeter gun. I use about 10 centimeters of overhang. And I balance the gun out for that. And with a 110, I use about 12 and a half inches of overhang. Yeah. And, what happens is proportionally, as you put those different size spear guns out in front of you, your instinctual aim point doesn't really change, because proportionally you've maintained that proportion.
Okay, I see what you mean.
Okay, so that's how I tend to think of it. And then as far as the weight goes, the weight makes a big deal. I don't like to have a lot of extra guns sticking out. And another good reason I think is that if the shaft isn't properly supported, particularly when you're running like a 7 mil shaft and some hot bands, when you pull the trigger, half that shaft is supported, but the part that's not, what's it going to do as soon as it gets that force behind it? Is it going to flex?
Unguided. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I have no clue where you're going to hit.
10 to 13 inches is around sort of that 260 millimeters to sort of 320 millimeters. A lot of guys say that 300 millimeters is the ideal overhang. I've heard some people say 500 millimeters, which is huge. I mean, that's, what are we talking, 18 inches? Like, it's more. It's 20 inches of overhang. It's crazy. So it's very interesting. Like Duncan's, who makes roller spear guns a lot, he has minimal overhang. Like we're talking 4 inches of overhang as well. So it's very interesting. Like you say, it's like religion and politics. Everyone's got an opinion. So
also, with rollers are a little bit different, and so are blue water guns. I actually bring the overhang back a little bit on blue water guns because you're dealing with a slip tip primarily. And I want that slip tip. I like the line on the slip tip to be as short as possible, because that tail is going to cause that shaft to track as it's moving in the water. So the less outside influence you have on that shaft, the more true your shot's going to be.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah. And also, the longer that thing sits out, the more likely you're going to catch your slip tip line. And, you know, there's nothing worse than seeing a 80-pound wahoo swim by and your slip tip is hanging off. You know, that's time for suicide.
Some guys swear that the longer overhang helps them with aiming.
It does. Well,
Okay.
You're closer to the fish.
Oh, okay. Oh, I thought they meant like sort of like when you're triangulating, which seems to, like a lot of guys don't sight, you know, directly down the line of their barrel. They'll have their gun at all sorts of different crazy angles, but sort of by feel and intuition, they can somehow triangulate in a line where they want to shoot on the fish, and it just sort of happens by magic, rather than, do you know what I mean? Rather than by some, you know, strict marksman sort of principles like you use in with firearms.
Yeah. So with firearms, I'm one of these guys. I like to shoot long distances, and it's one of those things I have to really concentrate on what I'm doing. I've got to calculate all these different things, and I like the challenge of hitting a target that is 500, 800 meters away. That's very difficult. If you know how to do it, it's really not that tough. You're just, you know, you're calculating it out and making it happen. A fish swimming by in front of you, you got all these different factors that are going on. You're holding your breath. That thing's moving. It certainly doesn't want to get killed. And you're sitting there with something that is a whole lot less accurate, you know, trying to hit it. For me, I know when I pull the trigger whether or not I've hit that fish. I don't even have to look. I also know when I don't. The really screwed up thing is I can't make myself not pull the trigger.
Yeah, it's a hard one, that. I did the same thing.
Yeah. And, you know, but when I know I've got that fish, I've got that fish. And, but most of it is instinctual. I watch some GoPro videos of myself when I shoot fish from time to time. And there are times when the fish will be completely obscured and I can't see it at all, because the GoPro's on my head. And all of a sudden there's the fish. And within a second, I've acquired the target and I've pulled the trigger and hit the fish. And it's like, how did I do it so quickly? I don't understand. But yeah, I think a lot more people probably do it that way than really realize they do.
Yeah, I think so too. I think some people think they're very methodical, but it's an intuitive thing that develops over time, which is also a good argument to get in a swimming pool and really fire your gun like 100 times before you ever take it out and start trying to shoot fish with it. But none of us do that either.
I know, that's horrible.
Yeah, but isn't it good when you just know exactly what that gun in your hand is going to do and how it's going to behave and what you can expect from it. It makes such a big difference to your spearfishing.
Yep. Yeah, it does.
Enclosed track versus open track. How do you decide what to do with that?
Oh my God, another religion question.
These come from my community. These guys like asking religious questions. But I think the beauty about having a conversation about a podcast is everyone gets to represent their views, and, you know, like everyone's got an opinion, but it's fine. It's nice to sort of expand on it occasionally. So,
well, I agree. And I've dealt with math a lot. I was a cryptologist ages ago. So we pounded a lot of formulas. What I figured out is that when you're dealing with the difference between an open track and an enclosed track, and let's say two 14 millimeter small ID bands and a shaft that weighs 1.5 pounds, you're talking about a couple of feet per second difference. So if that fish gets hit at 400 feet per second, or by a shaft moving at 400 feet per second versus one moving at 398 feet per second, it's still going in the box. You know, I've got open track spear guns over here that I use. I think they can be just as accurate provided you balance the bands to the shaft and the gun. Yeah. And I've got enclosed track guns that you don't have to be quite as picky about what you do. And for example, one of my customers runs 3 bands on a 7 millimeter shaft These are 316 millimeter bands, and they're pretty hot. They're tied at about 380% or something like that. And anyway, he shoots with that gun, and he hits the target. If I take that gun and put it in my hand, I shoot a whole lot of water.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't hit the damn target. But I will say that an enclosed track gun, as long as the shaft is straight and you pull the trigger, the distance of the enclosed track, that shaft is going exactly where the gun is pointed. The shaft has no choice. Neither do you. That shaft is just going, and it's going down that track. With an open track, there is some possibility that it's going to get away, and move around. I personally like an enclosed track. I find them quicker to load. I don't have issues with line routing, but I never had issues with line routing on an open track either.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's one of those things. As you become a better spear fisherman, or not better, that's the wrong word. As you become a more experienced spear fisherman, because I wouldn't consider myself a better spear fisherman. I'm more experienced.
I like it.
Good distinction.
Believe me, I miss my share of fish.
Yeah.
But as you gain experience, you gain comfort, and you're more comfortable, wrapping that line around and reloading things, getting your gear in order between shots.
A lot of guys have different struggles with spearfishing. For some people, it's freediving, and other people it's hunting. For me, my biggest struggle is always shooting accurately, I think, and it's consistently plagued me. One thing that I anecdotally believe about my better accuracy in recent times is the gun I now use has the mechanism is like it sits almost directly on top of my my aiming hand. So what I mean is like the shaft clearance to the top of my hand is very minimal, and that I don't know if, just bear with me, I don't know if that is helping me to get some increased accuracy. Do you have any opinion on that, on how flush the mech and where the spear shaft, sits in alignment with your hand?
The closer the mechanism is to the path of travel of the shaft, I think it's going to reduce recoil.
Okay.
So a lot of your pipe guns, you're able to move the handle and your trigger finger way up high, right underneath the shaft. With wood guns, oftentimes you can't do that because you've got to have a certain amount of wood there, otherwise the gun's not stable. Yeah. So, but that's where mass can come in. It's one of those things on.
Okay. You're trading off one for another. You're getting increased stability. So perhaps I wouldn't get the trigger flinch that I'm getting maybe with a pipe gun.
It's possible. The other question is how are your bands tied? Bands are the power plant of the gun, and if they're not set up right, or they're overly aggressive or too hard to pull back, or are too snappy, that really impacts the flight of the shaft. And I've got spear guns where I've got them set up for myself where the band stretch is between 300% and 380%. And it depends on what I want to do with that gun. I've got an open track gun that I've got at 300%, and I keep a single wrap on it. I drop down, and it's a 110 centimeter gun. I can shoot anything on the reef with that gun. I just have to get within about 3 to 4 meters of it, because that's all the shooting line I have.
I shoot everything that close anyway. I don't really like taking longer shots, but I do tend to overpower guns a little bit. But talking to some people, they say you can't really overpower them. But yeah, it's interesting. So, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I was just thinking as you're talking.
Well, I think it's interesting that I believe that you can definitely overpower a gun. So I was talking with a guy that's been hunting blue water for a few years the other day, and he insisted on having 4 bands on the gun. It was a blue water gun. He's using it for wahoo. He's using an 8mm shaft, and he took it out and he used it. And he said that he changed things up recently, and he went to 3 bands on it instead of 4. And the reason was that he got in a hurry. because he had missed a fish and he had to quickly reload. So he just loaded 3 bands. He swam down, pointed the gun, pulled the trigger, and the shaft went exactly where he was aiming instead of kind of in the area of where he was aiming. So
okay.
Now he's sitting there, he's in the chum slick, and he's pulling the trigger, shooting pilchards from, what was he saying? He was about 8 meters away. He's shooting pilchards floating in the chum slick.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. And he's like, that's it, 3 bands. And, so it made a difference, even on a gun that weighs, God, what did that gun weigh? About 4.5 kilos.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a big fat gun. So.
Wow. I'm envious of the snipers. I've got a guy that I go out with, and he has narrow eustachian tubes. So sometimes, we can't dive some of the deeper drops, but he's a great guy to dive with because he's just got mad shooting skills. Like, he'll be down at like 10 meters, but he'll be popping stuff in 16 meters and like top down shots as well. And I just can't believe it. I'm laying down there on the bottom just throwing sand like a drongo. And a drongo is a really dumb bird, and he's getting all the fish. So I laugh sometimes because the snipers definitely have a skill set that that most of us can only dream of.
Yeah, well, I always get really pissed off when I make a really challenging dive. Let's say I make a 30-meter dive. I'm down there and I'm staring at mutton snapper that just won't come into range, and I start paddling up and I'm like, where the hell's my dive buddy at? And he's over there fighting an African pompano that swam up to it. And it's like...
Upgrading to composite or carbon fiber spearfishing fins is a huge step in your spearfishing journey, and you want to make a smart investment. So I'm going to suggest investing your moolah in penetrator fins. These fins have got long-lasting performance. They've got a warranty that outperforms anything else in the industry. Check them out at penetratorfins.com. Their before and after sales service is absolutely phenomenal. These fins are being worn by champions all over the world. Check them out at penetratorfins.com. For a limited time only, use the code Spearo to save $25 on any purchase of composite or carbon fiber fins. Check them out, penetratorfins.com. Spearing Magazine, possibly the world's best spearfishing publication. It's a spearing mag for spearos by spearos. Part of the reason I like Spearing Magazine so much is because there's crazy stories from spearos just like you from all around the world, and it's what makes Spearing Magazine such a special publication. If you go to spearingmagazine.com, check out the article submissions page. There's a full guide to how to submit an article, but I would encourage you to do so because I want to read about your adventures and inspire everyone else to take on their next spearfishing adventure. That's at spearingmagazine.com. So we got lost in some technical weeds, and I think it's great. But just back to our guys that are building these guns for the first time. So a composite stock where you cut out plywood or something, is that a good way to go, or do you like going with this solid bit of pine as your first stock?
First of all, I wouldn't use plywood.
Okay.
Plywood has some characteristics that I think are probably potentially dangerous. I don't know. You might be able to do it and get away with it, but what I would recommend is getting a hold of a decent wood supplier. There's lots of them out there. And there's a lot of different woods you can use. Everybody insists on using teak, and I myself, I like to use teak because it holds up. It lasts forever. My customers can take it out and totally trash it. A little bit of sandpaper and some oil looks beautiful. If you're going to laminate a gun, you need to think about the expansion and contraction of the different pieces that you've laminated together.
Okay.
So I'm not a big fan of mixing and matching woods unless they're of similar densities and grain structures.
Yeah.
They might be really pretty, but if you get things moving at a different speed when they're drying out or getting wet, you potentially could have delamination.
Yeah, okay.
I like to use epoxy to laminate everything together, and don't use a fast curing epoxy. Use something that is like a 1-to-1 that's going to have a pot life of maybe an hour, but it's not going to be set let's say sandable. It's not going to be sandable for 8 to 10 hours.
Okay.
You want it to soak into the wood and really make a nice bond. And I've never had a gun delaminate. In fact, that was me knocking on wood. I've never had a gun delaminate, and I think a lot of it is luck. Now, I don't do a lot of laminated guns anymore. But use good quality wood. You can use mahogany. Some people will use Paduke. Let's see, there's a wood called Sipo that is pretty popular.
What do some of the popular manufacturers use? Like what's Rife using? What's Alemani using? What are some of these?
To be honest, I don't know. They'll tell you they're using teak, and a lot of them are. Like Rife, I think, uses a lot of teak. And going back to laminating guns, it's difficult to get a hold of 8/4. In the States, we call it an 8/4 piece of teak. It is. I use wood that's roughly 50 millimeters long, or thick, and so you've got to have pretty heavy duty equipment in order to cut it. But a lot of wood that's out there is probably in the 2 to 2.5 centimeter width, and if you've got that, you're definitely going to have to laminate it together. So I would say laminate. Now you also want to make your test gun out of something that's very inexpensive. A test gun doesn't even have to be completely straight. Get it close. What you're doing is you're test fitting things to make sure that you actually understand the geometry, because where things sit might have a huge impact on how much trigger pull you have or don't have. But did I answer that?
Yeah, man. No, that's pretty good. So we've got our stock of wood there. It's everything we need. What components do we need to buy? And obviously we've mentioned Neptonics, which have been selling these awesome components for a long time. What do you need to buy, and then what do you recommend? So
it's pretty simple. You're going to need a trigger mechanism. You're going to need some kind of a handle. So Neptonics and Koa, and there's a couple of other companies out there that sell parts. You can buy a handle base, which is basically you've got the trigger and you've got a mounting point to put a grip on. You can get fancy and do a skeleton grip that you're going to glue or screw pieces of wood to the handle. But you're going to need some kind of a handle, and you're going to need a line anchor. Let's see, the line anchor or line anchor / line guide. If you're doing an enclosed track, you don't need a line guide up near the front to wrap the line around. But if you're doing an open track, you will need something to wrap the line on to keep the shaft from flopping off the front of the gun. And what I always recommend doing once you've got your components, let's go back to that real quick. So those are basically your components. You're also going to need bands. Think about what size bands you're going to need or use for fishing in your area, because that's going to dictate what size band slot you use or make and how many bands you want to put on that gun.
Okay, let's just go over it again. So we need a trigger mechanism, a handle, possibly a line guide if it's open track, and then we need bands. Have I covered it off there?
Yep, and a line anchor. So
and a line anchor.
And and the line anchor is on the bottom part of the gun. That's what you're going to wrap your line around underneath, or your reel line is going to go through that if you shoot a reel. Okay,
cool. All right. And there's a lot of talk about mechanisms. The reverse trigger mechs are the kind of the happy flash word that gets thrown around. What are your opinions on trigger mechanisms?
Okay, I like this question. There's several decent trigger mechanisms. And if I use Neptonics, I've got the most experience with their trigger mechanisms. They're rock solid. They use a solid box of a solid steel box, and they put all of the components for the trigger inside of it. And there's really nothing in there to fail. A spring can break every now and then, but I think they're warranted for like 10 years.
Okay.
So, that's a very long time. The difference between like most trigger mechanisms and a reverse mech, the reverse mech, usually what the makers have done is they shaved off the top part of the trigger mechanism, and they have put the sear further back in the trigger mechanism. And the sear is the part that actually holds the shaft in place.
Okay.
So it sits further back. It holds the shaft. By doing that, you're moving the shaft back an inch or two.
Okay.
Or let's say, 25 to 35, maybe 35 to 40 centimeters. That's nice because you get more band stretch, which is a big deal on a spear gun. And I use a reverse mech on most of my enclosed track guns for that reason. There's one other reason that I use it. And with the Neptonics reverse mech, it auto resets. I sell a lot of guns to new spear fishermen. And with that line release flopping around as they're trying to load the gun, sometimes it gets in a position where it blocks the trigger, so the sear can't engage the shaft. And they come back in. They're complaining. They're like, "Oh, I don't know if it's working right." And it's like, "You're fine. The gun's fine. You just need to use gravity." And once that's explained to them, they get it. But I would say 1 in 10 people will come in and they're like, "Man, it just ruined my trip." And I'm like, "Everything's fine. This is what it is." And they feel like a fool. And I hate it. It's really tough to tell somebody that that's the problem.
Yeah.
Because it's one of those things they think then, well, God, I should have known that. And it's, no, you're new.
Yeah.
We've all been there. So,
but it's a damn shame for them too if it's ruined a trip, or and they just haven't been able to figure out how to reload their gun.
Absolutely. So, and see, safeties. I put safeties on some of my guns, and I explain to everybody if the safety is engaged, the shaft will not go into the trigger. About once a year, I'll get somebody that'll come in and tell me their gun's broke, and I'll push the safety out of the way, and the shaft immediately goes in, and they're like, "How'd you do that?"
So how come you use the safety? Because a lot of us hate them, to put it kindly.
If you look at my guns, I don't have a safety. My safety is attached to my hand permanently.
Yeah, it's storing that trigger finger unless you're actually intending to shoot.
Yeah, I've got a lot of trigger discipline, and I never touch that trigger until I'm ready. But I do have people that, particularly new divers, new spear fishermen, free diving is dangerous, spearfishing is dangerous. Oh my God, there's sharks in the water. They're nervous about a lot of things, and they're trying to eliminate risk. They think that putting a safety on a gun is going to help them do that. And it does, I guess. But, personally, I don't like a safety. I don't point it at something you don't want to put a hole in. It's that simple.
Okay, so we've got our stock, we've got our components. I guess the next thing we need to do is make sure we've got all the tools we need before we start the job. I watched a couple of vids last night, and the sheer list of tools this guy was using would make it absolutely ridiculous for me to build a spear gun unless I was going to build 10, because then I think maybe I would have an economy of scale that was, worth my time and energy. But I don't know that necessarily people build guns to save money. They build them because it's just maybe that it's addictive and it's kind of fun. It's not for everyone by any stretch, but what tools do we need?
Let's see. If you're going to be cutting your own blanks, you're going to need some kind of a saw. I like a table saw. You potentially could do it with a track saw or a circular saw to cut that thing, but it's not. You're going to have a very difficult time getting everything perfectly straight. And you also want the gun to be square, because as you start cutting into it with a router, you're going to, if it's not square, you're going to have a hard time making everything line up. So that's the next piece. Is a table saw is a very nice to have. A router, I think, is absolutely essential. If you don't have a router, you potentially could use a sander, literally sand out an open track, and all you're really doing is putting a groove in it. You could even carve it out with a couple of chisels. So, and if you've got a set of chisels, you definitely want to make sure they're good and sharp, because you're going to need them to square off the trigger mechanism hole or the trigger pocket.
Yeah.
So chisels. I use now. I'm fortunate. Not fortunate. Because I build spear guns, I went out and I bought a mortising machine that actually it's got a square chisel in it. So in the time that you do one, I can probably do 50. Yeah, it's pretty slick.
So you still drill the holes before you put the mortise chisel in?
No. With the mortise chisel, there's actually a drill bit inside of it.
Oh wow!
And it's got a heavy duty. I think the arm on the thing is 3/4 of an inch thick, solid steel. You pull down on that sucker, and I weigh 220 pounds, and I'd say half my body weight is on that arm, and it just chews right through it. And pop it back up, scoot it over half an inch, and do it again. Yeah, you can carve a rectangle in a spear gun. It takes me about 2 minutes to cut a trigger mechanism. You're definitely going to need a decent sander, a palm sander, vibrating sander. If you have a belt sander, you could potentially clamp that to the bench and use that to shape the gun in different ways. Let's see, what else?
I was just thinking to get the stock straight. You were talking about it briefly, but you talked about aluminum channels and you need a lot of clamps.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'd say get a half a dozen clamps that are big enough to hold the stock straight when you're gluing it up. And you can never have too many clamps. Most of us, I think most people that build spear guns are probably fairly, mechanically inclined is probably a good way to put it. So, you're likely to reuse these tools over and over again.
So if you're a handy person, you've maybe got half of the stuff. But if you don't generally muck around with it, and you've just got the standard, cordless drill and hammer and a couple of screwdrivers, you're going to go out and make a big capital investment in some of this equipment.
Yeah. One of the other tools that is very handy to have, I have a thickness planer, and a thickness planer basically has a solid base, and then it's got a movable cutter head that drops down, and I can run a 10-inch wide piece of wood through that thing and make both sides parallel to one another. Now I can do the same thing on the table saw, just by running it through and just cutting however much off I want on the table saw. It's not quite as accurate on the table saw, but it can be. So the table saw it's a wonderful tool. There's a lot of different ways to use it. Something else is you can make basically a sled. So when I square my blanks up, what I do is I actually drop them onto a sled that is it's a 3/4 inch piece of wood that's about 10 inches wide, and it's got holes drilled in it so that I can clamp the spear gun stock to that flat piece of wood.
Okay. That
flat piece of wood I know is square and straight. So what I do is I line it up. I've got some index pins, and I push the stock, the straight edge of the stock against those index pins, and then I run it through the table saw.
Okay, and that gives you a very precise.
Right. So the bottom is going to be flat. Now I've got a side that is exactly 90 degrees to that side, or to the bottom. Yeah. So now I can rotate it 90 degrees, and I can cut the next edge off. Usually what I do is at that point I take it off the sled and I run it through just using the table saw and the fence. And now I can actually square the blank up the rest of the way. The biggest trick is to get if you can get one side completely flat, then you clamp it in using a sled like that. And if you look up a squaring jig or joining, go to like YouTube and look up using a jointer or a table saw for a jointer.
Okay.
There's a lot of different people that'll show you how to do it. And I've even got a couple of clips on Instagram.
Okay.
And pushing work through the table saw.
So is that just Killshot Spearguns on Instagram?
Yes, it's Killshot _Spearguns. I don't know how, but somebody else had Killshot Spearguns.
Well, there's only so many spear this and spear that and spearo this and spearo that. You know, like we're remarkably predictable with our with the names we give our little projects and stuff. So
I know.
Yeah. But I like Killshot Spearguns. I think it's a cool name. So Killshot_Spearguns on Instagram, and you've got this square sled sort of set up there to demonstrate. Have you ever videoed the entire process of making a spear gun?
I have, but I haven't put it all together and published it yet. And it's not because I don't want to, it's because I'm lazy.
Yeah. It's a lot of work.
It is. It's a lot of work, and I want to be able to put out decent content, not look like a third grader did it.
Yeah. Yeah, but everyone starts somewhere, Ed, and you're your own worst critic.
I know.
Like if I only published the podcast that, you know, I felt like I was slick and cool and not a third grader, there'd probably be 3 episodes, you know. So I'd encourage you to do that, because it's great, like, talking through the process on the podcast, but, you know, just the nature of just audio only, it's never going to be quite as good. I'd love to see the full process done, but like you're talking, how many hours does it take you start to finish, even with all your gear set up? Your you know, I'm sure you've got a very systematic process by now. How long start to finish? Obviously, you set them aside for some hours as well, and there's waiting processes and stuff like that. But
yeah.
What do you think the time outlay is? And probably your process is more efficient, so what's the likely time output for someone who doesn't have your background?
Well, it's interesting. It's very predictable. So it takes me roughly 3 minutes per pass when I'm cutting out an enclosed track. So I do 4 passes to cut the slot to pour the epoxy into for an enclosed track. So what is that? 12 minutes. You know, that's what it takes. Now, as far as the actual, you know, the days, typically I will cut the wood, get it square, hog out all the material to pour the track. I'll then pour the track the next day and do other things. Then I will come back the following day, plane that off, and then do most of the shaping and cutting of the track. So it's really about 2 full days.
Okay.
Whether I do 1 gun or, well, let's say I do 10, it pretty much takes about the same amount of time. You know, it does take longer to do 10 guns just because you got to do everything times 10. But, you know, setting it up and doing it just for 1 gun, when you're running a business, that's not effective.
Yeah. So it's batching.
Yeah. But when you're doing it as an individual, you want to take more time because you don't have the experience and the comfort. For me, a lot of this, I go on autopilot. You know, I know that my trigger mech is going to be 5.5 inches from the back of the gun. And when I'm actually done with the gun, I'm going to cut 1/2 inch off. The distance now between the trigger mech and the butt of the gun is going to be 5 inches. You know, so I just know that. So I don't have to measure that 10 different times to make sure that it's right and then dry fit it. You know, so don't get in a hurry. There's that old saying about measure twice, cut once. Usually what I say is cut once, go to Home Depot, and then cut again. So familiar with Home Depot?
Yeah. We have a version of it here in Australia and New Zealand called Bunnings. But it's a great store. I absolutely love it. It's a great way to spend a Saturday. But yeah. We have got, again, bogged down in the process, and it's fantastic. I wanted to sort of bring us up a little bit and talk about buoyancy and ballast.
Okay.
How do you balance a spear gun?
All right. So I mentioned math earlier. Depends on what kind of gun I'm doing, but I sat down and kind of crunched the numbers. And what I tried to do was get the gun pretty close to neutral buoyancy, but I wanted it to sink. And you've got a couple of things to consider with, I like the front of the gun to be slightly heavier. I want to feel the weight in my hand. I don't want it to be heavy, but I want some feedback. When I built my first spear gun, I was so proud of myself because, man, I let go of that thing and it sank perfectly straight in the water.
Oh, wow.
Excited. I was like, oh, this is badass. I couldn't hit the broadside of a barn with it. And what it was my whole life I've always had spear guns that the tip weighed more in your hand, so that you had feedback coming back telling you that, yes, I need to lift that up, or I need to, it's pulling down or whatever. Well, all of a sudden I'm not getting any feedback from the front of the gun. And I'm sitting there and I'm lining up my shot, and I'm keep looking over the top of the gun to make sure that it's in the right place, because my hand isn't telling my brain that it hasn't moved. It's a weird arms, particularly if you've shot handguns. You're very used to that feedback of having that gravity affecting the gun. And all of a sudden I didn't have it, man. So I went home after the first time I used the gun, and I drilled a hole in the bottom of it and dropped the lead weight in it. I was much happier with it.
Okay.
Now, from a safety perspective, if you drop a spear gun on the reef and it sinks butt first, that's a really dangerous situation, particularly for free diving, because that gun is now pointing at us. And we're going to have to go down and go get the damn thing. So I like them to sink slightly tip down. But again, I don't like them to be heavy. There's a couple of guys I spearfish with, and they have some spear guns that are made by some of my competitors. They always I always let people borrow my spear guns, and we're out there for Wahoo one day. And this guy hands me, I don't know, it's a 130, 140 centimeter gun, or centimeter gun. And he hands it to me, and I put it out in front of me. I was like, oh my God, I need two hands to hold it up.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it was just so heavy, and it just wore me out trying to dive with it. And with mine, I try to get that weight so that when you're holding on to it, a 90 centimeter gun or a 140 centimeter gun, they feel the same. It's tough to do, but the more wood you have, the more you can play with the buoyancy. I've got a page of math that I do whenever I'm building blue water guns. I sit down and I calculate out what the density of the gun is. Then I calculate everything that I'm going to be cutting off of it. And then I calculate out what all the different components are going to weigh. And then I figure out, okay, I need this much lead. And then I make up little ballast weights. They're about 30 grams a piece. And I can drop them into the track or underneath the track of the spear gun. So when I epoxy over it, they're gone. You don't even know they're there. And then I do one of two things when I'm done with the gun. I take it out. I've got a boat ramp right behind me, and it's, 50 meters from the back of the shop. So I just go down to the boat ramp and I toss the gun in the water and see how it floats or sinks. Okay. And then from there, I can decide if I want to add weight in a certain place or not. Typically, I'll go ahead and put it in, and if I need to add additional weight, I make a decision on whether it's a lot of weight or it's a little bit. If it's a little bit, I'll usually put it in. I make different shaped lead ingots, kind of like a lead plug, and drill it out, drop it in, epoxy it, and then I cover it with a wood plug.
Okay. So
yeah,
you can't even see it.
Exactly. Yeah, it kind of blends right in. And then if I've got to add a lot of weight, I usually do some kind of a vanity plate, and I just cut out. I figure out exactly where the lead needs to go. I melt it down, and then I drop that weight in, screw it in. Then we cover it with some kind of a vanity plate, either aluminum or plastic of some kind. Yeah. The cool thing there is if the user then decides he wants to change shafts, maybe he wants to go from an 8 mil to a 9 mil shaft, it's easy for me to do. We just pop that lead weight out and we put a new one in. And something I'm going to say real quick about lead: do not melt lead and pour it into the wood. It's bad. What you're doing is you're sucking all of the moisture out of the wood in that particular spot, number one. If you have laminated your gun, and most of you guys that are going to build guns are probably going to laminate them. If you've laminated it and you've used epoxy breaks down at about 200 degrees.
Okay.
And that lead, when you pour it in, is at 750 degrees or hotter. And you will just destroy your laminations. So do not pour the lead in. Carve something else out, pour the lead into it, and then put it into your spear gun and screw it into place or epoxy it in.
Daniel, man, had a cheeky question. He says, "Why is oil a terrible choice to finish a spear gun?"
It sounds like he's already made up his mind.
He has. He's very biased. He's made a lot of spear guns himself, and he's very opinionated, as anyone who does anything for a while, I think, is. So, what do you think?
I don't really agree with him on that one.
Okay.
So, I use an oil blend finish. What I do is I put oil down on the gun first. It's actually an oil thinned with a solvent, so that it penetrates well. So I get decent penetration. I do 2 coats of that, and then I switch to what I call my secret sauce, which is it's kind of a combination of oil, polyurethane, and a thinner. And what that does is it creates kind of like a hand-rubbed finish over the gun. And the polyurethane helps to kind of keep water out, and it keeps that finish looking nice for a longer period of time. Oil does get sucked out of the gun pretty quickly. So when the first time you use the gun, it's going to look okay. You can tell you used it if you just used oil. You're going to have to oil the gun a second time, and a third time, and a fourth time. There's a lot of people that say, "Oh, epoxy is the only way to go." I've used epoxy for 35 years, 40 years on different things. It's great on fishing rods. I don't like it on spear guns. What you're doing is you're taking a piece of wood that is going to expand and contract and will suck up moisture when it gets wet, and you're going to coat it in plastic. When you get a little chip on that epoxy, that water gets in there, and over time it will eventually spall and cause the epoxy to be undermined around that hole. So you start from a little pinprick. The next thing you know, you've got something the size of, I don't know, a couple centimeters in diameter. Have you ever tried to sand epoxy off of a spear gun? Yeah, I'd rather throw it away. That said, you do the same thing with some kind of an oil and like a poly gun. I use a lot of polyurethane. Polyurethanes are amazing. They're fairly thin, they penetrate well, and they're very, very, very robust. They last a long time. I've got a gun that came in today, actually, that's sitting in the back that I sold 3 years ago to a guy, and he uses it all the time. It's polyurethane, and it still looks pretty good. And what I've recommended to him, and he does, is he rubs it down with oil periodically to cover the wood or to protect the wood that gets where the nicks and dings are. Here in another year, maybe 2, I'll actually take that gun and I'll sand off the poly and we'll put a new coat on it, and he'll be off to the races. So, but so I like a finish that I can retouch, because to me, a spear gun is a tool.
Yep.
And I was out shooting grouper just before the season closed, and I use a float line. I'm one of these nerds around here that I love a float line. I've got a reel on the gun, but I usually lock it down because float lines don't jam. So I plug this grouper. He goes running into a hole and right out the backside of the coral head. And I watched my spear gun go into it, and it hit every single inch of that coral head. So it was just mangled. And he drug it out the other side, which made it very entertaining trying to retrieve the fish. But anyway, the gun was a little bit worse for the wear, but a little bit of sandpaper, it'll bounce right back.
Yeah. Does it annoy you? Like a lot of the boats I go on, generally we just jam our guns into the side pockets or up the front of the boat. Generally the weight belts are down the back in a bucket, but everything else is in there with them. As a spear gun maker and a spear gun lover, would that situation just infuriate you?
No, it really does. In fact, I encourage all of my customers to be very abusive with their spear guns.
Yeah,
that's how I generate new business.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't bother me. So when I'm spearfishing, the only time that gun storage is an issue for me, where I get on people, is when it's a safety issue. Somebody puts a loaded spear gun in the boat, and we do from time to time depending on, particularly when we're blue water fishing.
Yeah.
That gun's pointed in the wrong direction, man. It's going to be a bad day for somebody.
Yeah.
Probably the guy getting yelled at by me. But yeah, safety is a big one. But as far as I don't like to abuse my spear guns, but I make them simple and I make them robust for a reason. I've been at this game for a long time. I've seen some crazy shit happen to people's gear.
Yeah.
And you can't take a carbon fiber gun and drop it, 3 feet onto the deck and just smash the crap out of it without fear of breaking something.
Yeah.
With the wood gun, probably not going to hurt it. You're probably going to get yelled at by the guy that owns it, but yeah.
Yeah, cool. Duncan asked me to ask you, what are the common problems with people's homemade wooden guns? And this is probably a good one to ask because I guess do you see a lot of guys come in with their homemade guns and reporting issues?
I get a few people that come in from time to time. And unfortunately, it's going to get a whole lot worse. I've got a partnership done up with a company here in the States where I'm building a blank kit for them.
Okay.
And so basically what I'm doing is I've milled out an enclosed track and the trigger mech and the handle base and everything, and then they can shape the gun. Okay. And I'm going to get people that are going to do some crazy things to it. And trying to think ahead of what are some of those problems, I've put together kind of an instruction list of, when you lay out the gun, make sure that it's flat and square. Don't round all the edges and expect to be able to find dead center. A lot of it may seem like common sense, but if you've never built a spear gun before, it's not. And in fact, I can send you a copy of that.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Yeah, it's pretty simple stuff, but it's one of those things where if you don't think about it, if you've never done it before, what's that old line about experience is what you get exactly after you need it?
Yeah.
It's that's how we all learn. So
it is, and it's it's just funny. Like we all learn that way. It's like a rite of passage or something for us to just do it the hard way, the first way. And I don't fault guys for doing it because I've learned a whole lot of shit that way. But jeepers, sometimes you just wish you could spare yourself the pain.
Yeah, well, it's, as somebody with some experience, it's kind of fun to watch people go through that struggle sometimes.
Yeah.
So I think I see a couple of things. Oftentimes people will overbuild a spear gun. So, they want a 40 centimeter gun. The thing is like, I don't know, 6 centimeters in diameter. It's a massive chunk of wood. They didn't have the tools to be able to get rid of most of that material, and hey, it's your first gun. I get it. My first gun, pretty ugly. It's not going to win any beauty contests. I guarantee it.
Yeah.
So I'd say, that not doing a good job with design is kind of an issue. Oftentimes people will add lead, and they'll do it in a way that they can't get it back out of the gun, and they wind up with a very, very heavy gun. And then people oftentimes are buying things they don't exactly know what to buy. So maybe they buy a shaft that's too heavy or too light, or they buy bands that, for whatever reason, they were sold bands that just aren't going to work for that gun, but they're trying to make it work, so there's a lot of trial and error in this. It's tough. The other thing that can be really difficult is setup, or I should say layout, how the gun is laid out, where the trigger mechanism is and where the handle base is absolutely critical, because if the trigger is too far forward, now you have a really long reach to grab the trigger. If it's too far back, it might be very uncomfortable for you to actually find the trigger to pull it. Okay. So, for me, I sat there and I played with it, and I wanted the trigger halfway down or in the middle of my finger pad.
Okay.
That's
okay. I get what you're talking about now. Yeah. Sorry, it took me a little minute to get what you were saying. So, like, your hand wraps the handle, and where on your index finger the trigger sits. So, like, whether it cups at the main knuckle or further forward up towards the tip. Yeah, that's a pain in the ass if the tip is, like the. I don't like it right up the end. It's got to be in the meat of your finger, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, see, I like it right there in the middle of my finger pad. But there are guys, there's a bunch of guys here locally. They want it further back. Okay. They want it on the first knuckle. And it's like, oh, God, for me, it's just, I don't know. It's like somebody running their fingernails down a chalkboard.
I guess the argument there would be they like the feedback through bone. Whereas, but you think the pad of your finger, like in between the two knuckles, would probably have the best receptors for force. I guess. I don't know. It's a funny thing to think about, isn't it?
It is, but again, I spent years shooting firearms, and so I like all of my guns to be set up the same, and I shoot a lot of guns that have got an AR style hand grip. Yeah, and so. When I switch to a spear gun, all of my spear guns have got an identical grip. So it's like I'm holding on to the same gun no matter what size it is. Okay. So there's little things that you can do to make yourself more successful as a spear fisherman, I think, and doing things like that lend consistency, it's really helpful.
We interrupt this Noob Spearo podcast to bring you a public service announcement. These shows are often explicit and filled with ridiculous levels of stoke and actionable info. For more stoke, head over to noobspearo.com/more stoke and join the Floater newsletter, an intermittent publication overflowing with spearfishing goodness. That's noobspearo.com/more stoke. You're welcome. Hey guys, today's podcast is brought to you by freedivingsafety.com. It's powered by Ted Hardy from Immersion Freediving. He won an award and he decided to create something that could help the whole world, every single person wanting to get into freedive spearfishing. There's a whole bunch of foundational principles and knowledge that you can learn at freedivingsafety.com. It'll help you to catch more fish and have more fun, believe it or not. It's not just a safety course. This is practical information in there for helping you to not only manage the risk, but to have more fun and look after your mates and yourself. Check it out, freedivingsafety.com. All right, so back to spear guns. Ed, where to next? So we've covered sort of the length and breadth of a lot of it. Maybe care and maintenance is we sort of touched on. Is that something else that we need to address?
Yeah, care and maintenance is a good thing to discuss. I've got clients that do not do anything to their spear guns. They literally bring them in and they throw them on the dock and they hit them with the hose and that's it. They pick them up, chuck them in the back of their truck.
They're your typical Shrek customers. Yeah.
I'm not much better than that, but I will say you're going to get a lot more life out of your spear gun, and I don't care what kind of spear gun it is, if you actually put the hose up to the trigger mechanism and flood the trigger mechanism. And then also, depending on the kind of handle, if it's got a hollow handle, hit the inside of the handle. Pull the shaft out and wash the shaft off separately. And let it. What I like to do is I like to leave the shaft outside of the track when they dry.
Okay.
And after an hour or whatever, I'll go ahead and pop it back in the track. But if you let that water sit in there, it may sit for a long time, particularly in a humid environment. And many of us that spearfish all the time live in humid places. So that's a biggie. The other thing is just you need to be observant about your spear gun. Injuries can happen if you're having problems with the trigger mechanism. Things just don't always seat right. If that happens, do not use the gun. That's a deadly weapon. Just like shooting through a 60-pound grouper, you're going to shoot right through a 150-pound person real easily. So, be very careful when it comes to noticing little weird problems. and call the manufacturer. Sometimes it's nothing. Sometimes it is. But I would much rather have somebody call me because they think they might have a problem than to go out there and accidentally kill somebody.
I think one of the beauties of the wooden guns too is just that ability to pop the mech out and do a good clean in it as well. That seems to be a huge advantage. How often do you recommend guys do that?
To be honest, I wouldn't pop it out unless you needed to.
Okay.
You can, like Shrek mentioned, most wooden spear guns have got 2 pins on the trigger mech, and you simply, I use a nail punch and tap it out and pull the pins out the rest of the way with pliers. But if you need to change out the mechanism, that's a great way to do it. Otherwise, just wet it down.
Okay.
So,
cool.
Make sure you clean it well with fresh water.
Okay. Do you just do it with a hose, or do you use a bucket?
I like running water. In fact, I'm a tech diver and a rebreather diver, and I own more damn dive gear than I know what to do with. I stopped using a rinse bin for my gear, and normally what I would do is I would actually hose it off with a hose.
Okay.
That running water, and you don't have to hit it with high power or anything like that. Just flowing water, it will carry the salt away. And you also won't trap bubbles somewhere, or you're not as likely to trap bubbles as you would if you put it in a rinse bin. But if you've got a rinse bin handy, why not? Go ahead and use it. There are times where I'll use both the rinse bin, as long as there's not a whole bunch of piss-stained wetsuits in it. There's nothing worse than somebody making soup.
Yeah. Good old urine soup and just mixing all your gear through it. It's a class act.
Yeah. It's that's nasty.
So we're still on maintenance and that, and on your website you've got an about section at killshotspearguns.com/about, and you've got some really good info in here just about spear guns and maintenance in general. But one thing I wanted to address was just bands, your rubbers. How do you maintain them? What life do you expect out of them? We can go religious and political with it if you want and talk about brands and distinctions, but yeah.
So bands are the power plant of the gun. It's that simple. If your bands don't work, your gun's not going to work. It's funny. I got somebody that brought a gun in yesterday. The bands up there near the wishbones look like a desiccated elephant penis. It was pretty horrible. So, and I asked him, I said, you want me to change these? And he's like, no, I usually use them until they break. I just kind of rolled my eyes. It's like, okay. So, so bands, I change mine every 6 to 8 months, probably. I don't get to go spearfishing as much as I'd like to go, but when I go, I'm typically in the water for 4 to 6 hours at a time, and that gun is loaded most of the time.
Yeah.
And UV light breaks them down real fast. And the second that you tie a knot to tie that wishbone, the clock starts ticking on that band. According to the guys over at Primeline, you can put bands inside of a cardboard box and they will last for 20 years.
Wow.
Until you tie that knot. And then you have about probably 400 days before that thing is going to, suffer dry rot.
Okay.
That's in ideal conditions. But I change my bands pretty frequently. I would suggest that everybody change their bands annually. You're talking, $15 to $20 per band, $25 per band. That grouper that you're about to go shoot, or that wahoo, is worth a whole hell of a lot more than that. So, get out there and take care of those bands. That's a biggie.
One disturbing thing I've been seeing lately is it seems like there's periodic upticks with metal wishbones. Do you have a hatred for them?
Yeah.
Yeah. Jeebus, they're the last thing you want to see with a new diver with one of those in their hands. Like I seen this guy's finger get destroyed the other day. By one of those things passing through. Jeepers, that'd hurt.
Yeah, I caught myself a few years ago. I had loaded a gun and had taken my finger off of the bands, and as I was pulling my hand out, the wishbone broke, and the metal caught my finger. Now, fortunately, it got most of the glove, and it only cut me a little bit. But I was wearing gloves. If I wouldn't have been wearing gloves, it would have been stitches time.
Yeah.
You know, it was pretty ugly. Metal wishbones have got their place. If you're a lot of spear gun manufacturers that use them do not polish the notches on the shafts. You know, the problem with an unpolished notch is it's really easy to cut yourself on it.
Yeah.
I got
just tears through Dyneema as well.
Yeah, I got 4 stitches one time. I was at home and I'm walking through the house. And my wife's like, "Hey, your hand is bleeding." And I looked down and I had a cut on my pinky from where I had run my finger across the notch on the spear shaft, and it had sliced my pinky wide open. I didn't even feel it, and you know, it was dripping blood all over the place. I wound up having to go to the ER and have it stitched up.
Jeepers. So do you use notches or finned shafts?
I use fins.
Yeah.
It's primarily because I use enclosed tracks or make enclosed tracks.
Yeah.
So you've got to have it, and then you know, once you've got an inventory of those, you know, it's hard for me to justify buying something else.
And sorry, I keep interrupting you, but the other thing I was thinking about was where the mono or Dyneema, if you're using that as shooting line, where that sort of plugs into the shaft, because you've got the rear hole where you tie, you know, or you've got the ones that it sometimes goes in the rear fin, or you know, sometimes they have a separate mounting, you know, like a tie-in point. What's your preference on that?
So, as far as the material to use,
no, where to tie into on the shaft?
so as far back as you can.
Okay.
If you think about the shaft, it's basically a tail stabilized projectile. You know, so if you've got that, the shooting line helps to stabilize the shaft as it's leaving and trailing away from the gun. So if you put that further up, like I've noticed that some manufacturers put a hole in every one of the tabs, the shark fins, and that could lead you to believe, well, maybe I should just put it anywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you think about it, if you put it in that middle, the middle tab, and you just hold on to the shooting line, the shaft is going to kind of hang in the, you know, at about a 45-degree angle.
Yeah.
If you tie all the way at that back one, it's pretty much going to go straight up and down. So, you know, that shaft has got to take that shooting line with it. Now, as far as what kind of shooting line to use, I'll start another semantic argument here.
Love it.
I like monofilament. Monofilament has memory, and it has a tendency when you pull the trigger, it drops off and then it gets pulled out in these big, huge loops.
Yeah.
Whenever I see people getting their bands tangled, a lot of times there are people that are using Dyneema. And what's happening is the Dyneema's limp and it's headed toward the fish. The other thing I like about monofilament is I tend to shoot the fish, swim over and try to grab the shaft and manage the fish immediately. You know, it's the quicker I can get my hands on it, the less likely a shark is to get a hold of it.
Yep.
So I can immediately get that guy under control. Going past a big loop of Dyneema, it's kind of hard to navigate. Where monofilament tends to be very rigid, you just kind of push it to the side, and I don't know, I don't get tangled up in it as easily. But my reel line, God, is one of the reasons I hate reels. You know, I've gotten horribly tangled up in my reel line before.
Yeah, it's a learning curve, that one, for sure. I think the other part, I had a spear gun I bought a while ago. It was a Salvamar Hero. Not to just, I'm not trying to name drop them, but the fins on it were still sharp, and the mechanism where the spear slotted in and the mono was tied on the back was really abrasive on the mech. And so I think it's another thing to pay attention to, is just to, you know, file the sharp metal edges down. If, you know, whether you're using Dyneema or monofilament, it doesn't really matter. That needs to be done. That I ended up losing a fish and a shaft I think like on the same dive day I used it. It's a fantastic gun, but they're just those small details. That was a little bit annoying.
Shafts are a tough one. I use a company in Tampa Bay. They're called Spearcrafters, and everything they do well. All of their shark fins they've got a really cool process for how they mount them. They basically weld them onto the shaft, and they don't really care that they're perfectly straight because they pop them into a CNC and they mill down both sides.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so by doing that, now it's absolutely dead center in the middle of that shaft. Then they come back and they put a rounded edge on all of those sharp edges. Yeah. And man, I don't have any complaints about the way those guys do things.
And are they using carbon steel, spring steel, or stainless?
They use something called 17-4. Yeah. It's 17-4 stainless, and it's got a higher amount of chromium, which I believe means that it can be more hard than other shafts. And the cool thing about them is they do not rust. I mean, spring steel, man, the first time you take it out, it gets rusty. With these guys' shaft, you really have to abuse the shaft to get it to rust. So, and the other thing too is they heat treat their shafts, which it reorganizes the molecules and everything in the shaft, and it makes them harder for one, and it makes them less likely to bend. Or I shouldn't say bend. The shaft will flex, but it will come back to true. I have watched those shafts literally bend like 30 degrees. I'm thinking to myself, oh, that sucker's trashed. And I'll get it up to the surface and put it back in the gun. And with an enclosed track, you can tell immediately if it's warped, because it starts to rub on the track. Nope, goes right back in. I've also got some that look like pretzels in the back. Big fish will do that.
Yeah, for sure. Ed, I am conscious of time. We've chatted ad infinitum today about spearguns. I don't think we've even scratched the surface of your knowledge, but it's been a real pleasure. And I want to do a full-length interview again, but I'd really like to wrap out today's sort of section on spearguns. Was there anything else that you felt like we didn't quite get to today that you really want to cover?
No, I mean we've covered a lot. Building spearguns definitely isn't easy.
No,
but it's one of those things that people shouldn't be hesitant to do either. Buy the parts, give it a try. And the cool thing is that if you don't like the way that you built it, then you take the parts off and you put them on a different gun. So I was talking about my ugly first gun that I ever built. Last week, I actually took the mechanism off the gun, and I'm getting ready to put it on a new gun. So that gun's 10 years old. Trigger back is 10 years old. It's getting ready to go on a brand new gun.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
And a lot of the skills are transferable. I think it gives you a real appreciation for what you are using sometimes when you're in the water, even if your homemade gun doesn't quite do what you wanted it to do. Perhaps, just the lessons learned gives you an appreciation for what's actually out there. So
yeah, it's the coolest thing in the world when you shoot your first fish with your gun.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I mean, you did it. You made it. So very rewarding.
I'm going to call this part one with Ed, building spear guns today, and I'm going to get you back very shortly for a full interview and hear a little bit more about your background spearfishing. How does that sound?
That sounds great.
Cool. Well, I'll catch you very shortly, I think.
Okay. Well, Shrek, it's been an absolute pleasure. I really appreciate it. You guys are doing a great job out there.
Cool. And guys can come and visit you at KillshotSpearguns.com and Killshot Spearguns on Instagram. You got a YouTube channel too, Ed?
You do. I do.
And
you're never going to guess what it's called.
Killshot Spearguns.
That's it.
Wow. This is a real good, consistent branding there. All right, man. I'll talk to you very shortly for a full-length interview.
All right, great.
All right, catch you, Ed.
All righty, bye.
Killshot Spearguns, timber guns made in the USA. Simple, effective, dependable, made in the Florida Keys by Ed Martin. These spearguns are an absolute work of art. Check them out at KillshotSpearguns.com. And hey, I've got a special for you, $30 off. Use the code Noob. That's just Noob. Noob. For a limited time only, save $30 on any spear gun at Killshot Spearguns. Save $30 on any spear gun. Check it out. Jeebs, I hope you stuck around through that whole episode. If you did, then I know that you're probably going to end up taking on one of these DIY wooden spear gun projects yourself. It's possibly a good time with all the corona madness as well. It's something that you could consider even taking on. We got lost right into the weeds, but I hope it inspired you and gave you some fuel for the fire if you are looking to take on your own DIY wood spear gun project. In 2 weeks, I'm off to chat with Valentine Thomas, who is a very interesting character in the world of spearfishing. She serves as an ambassador. She's been on Joe Rogan podcast and various magazines and TV shows. She heavily promotes spearfishing as a sustainable and safe sport, and she has a lot to say about ocean conservation, commercial fishing, becoming part of that process, and there's some really cool insights in this interview coming up, so I'm looking forward to sharing that. I'll see you guys in 2 weeks. If you would like to support the show, jump on patreon.com/Noob Spearo. Become a patron listener. There's 3 levels to support the show at. And hey, thanks for listening. This episode of the Noob Spearo podcast is brought to you by spearfishing.com.au. They've been on board for more than 100 episodes, and I'd love for you to shop at spearfishing.com.au. They have a price beat guarantee, hassle-free returns, flat shipping rates across Australia, and you can save $20. For every purchase over $200, if you use the code NoobSpearo, you save $20. Thanks for supporting the Noob Spearo podcast and shopping with spearfishing.com.au.